back to our final discussion of the six spheres of influence. We began by just talking about what the spheres are. We talked about what an ideal spheres of influence would look like. And then we talked about some of the things that could go wrong in the spheres of influence. And what we're going to talk about today is just how do you fix when things go wrong? How do you fix it? And also just kind of thinking about we don't have ideal spheres of influence, most of us. So how do you fix that? How do you get as close to the ideal as you can, even if you can't have the ideal? And so those are some of the things we want to talk about today.
All right. Seth, how do you get close to the ideal when you can't have the ideal?
So let's take Pride and Prejudice as an example, because I love the book, I love the story, and I think that Jane Austen does a great job of doing exactly that with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth's our main character.
Okay, here's spoilers for the book Pride and Prejudice, just FYI.
Yes. So in the book...
This is not a spoiler-free discussion.
No. In the book Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth has some very negative influences in her mother and her father, and then some of her younger sisters, specifically Lydia. And so as she starts to recognize that, and she doesn't actually, I think she recognized a little bit of the negative influence with her mother, and Lydia, she recognizes the negative influence right from the start. But her father, she doesn't. She doesn't actually recognize that influence until she gets the letter from Mr. Darcy after she refuses his proposal. And she recognizes then, okay, my parents are not, they're not healthy for me to have them at this level of influence, this family level of influence, right? And so what she has to do is she has to remove and replace. And that's how we fix. Always through remove and replace. And remove and replace is a principle that was taught by Jesus Christ. I usually use Luke chapter 11. It's also in Matthew somewhere, and I can't remember where in Matthew, but in Luke chapter 11, starting at verse 24, I believe, I'll make the correction if that's wrong in the notes, but the Lord heals, or he casts out a devil from a man, and after the after devil, some of his disciples are kind of excited about what he's done. And he tells them, the miracle is only half done. We've removed, but if this man wants to have the full miracle, he has to replace. He has to bring the Holy Ghost in to take the place of that evil spirit. And if not, then the spirit will come back with 7 spirits worse than itself, and the state of the man will be worse than it was in the beginning. So the Lord is saying a miracle includes both removing and replacing. So that's what we have to do. And so with Elizabeth
So we
Bennet,
cast out our demons, and then we have to fill them
then we have
with
to
angels.
fill that space. And so Elizabeth is able to, by the end of the book, move the influence of her parents. Even though she's still living with her parents, she is able to move their influence out of that family sphere.
Well, at the very end of the book, she's not living with her parents.
Well, no.
Very end of the book, she's living with Mr. Darcy.
Right.
Which is a nice distance away from her parents,
Right.
where they can't be visiting all the time. But I think the point that you're making here is that Elizabeth finds replacement people
Right.
to be her supportive thing. She really forms a close relationship with her Aunt Gardner. Her
Uncle
Gardner. That's her mother's brother and his wife.
Right, and they move into that space
Yeah,
where her parents had been, and where she
if
was.
you just watch a movie of this, it's not really as noticeable. But when you read the book, especially in the last chapter, and it talks about how at Pemberley, which is Mr. Darcy's home, when they're living there, that they are far away from her parents and that they see them now and then, but that Mr. and Mrs. Gardner are frequent visitors, and it talks about them in a way where you can tell they are they are friend and mentor figures
Right, well,
that are really close to them.
She was wanting to emulate them. It's very clear in the book that by the end of the book, this is what she's trying to emulate, rather than in the beginning of the book, she's trying to emulate her father. She loves her father. She loves the way he acts, his wit. She thinks he's clever and funny. She tries to emulate that. She's very witty, very clever.
And it makes her father's wit is very judgmental. He says, "What do we live but to make sport of our neighbors?" And he's saying there is his favorite occupation is to be judgmental of people in a humorous way, and
Right.
she's taken that on from him. Her sharp wit is really centered around this biting
Making
kind of
fun of
making
people.
fun of
It's
people.
about making fun of people. And so what ends up happening is, after she reads the letter from Mr. Darcy, she starts to realize and recognize this is a problem. And she starts to distance herself from her parents in her behaviors, in her influence. She's not wanting that influence any longer, and she's seeking the influence of her aunt and uncle Gardner. And of course, when she, like you said, when she moves to Pemberley, she's wanting to spend time with her aunt and uncle Gardner and minimizing the time spent with her parents. And that's exactly the right way to handle this. It's a remove and replace principle. Remove the negative influence of the parents and invite the positive influence of the aunt and uncle in this particular case. And that's how we can make corrections when our when our spheres of influence are not where they should be.
So a really popular trope in modern fiction is the found family. You see this in books and movies a lot. A lot of stories are around a ragtag group of characters. They're all really different. They come from different backgrounds, and they kind of form a family. And I think the reason that those stories are so powerful to us is, like you were saying, so many people have an empty sphere here, or a depleted sphere in this family
Right.
space. And you can correct it by strengthening positive relationships with the family members that you do have. But if you really don't have sufficient family relationships, or the family members that you have are going to be too negative an influence on you, found family is a really good place to fill this,
Right.
and that's one of the reasons it's so powerful in our current media, I think.
And so when I work with clients, oftentimes one of the things that we do is we create their spheres of influence, and I have them label everybody where they're at, and then oftentimes they're wrong, because most people are not very good at identifying their own spheres and the influences that people have in them in those spheres. Oftentimes they put in what they want their spheres of influence to look like, not what their spheres of influence actually
Now we
look
need
like.
to pause for a minute, because
Okay.
people who are watching this lesson, they don't have you all sitting down with them one-on-one to say, this is in the wrong place, this is in the wrong
Right,
place.
so-
How do you identify whether you've put somebody in the right place?
Well, I'm going to give you an example, because it's not an easy thing to do. But if I give you an example, it might help. So this happened with multiple clients that I've worked with, where what they'll do is they've had an abusive, especially when abuse is involved, or neglect. As a child, they were abused or neglected by one or two parents, right? So they don't then want that parent to be in the family circle, because they're angry and upset with that parent. And so when they draw up their sphere of influence, they'll draw their parent in the geopolitical oftentimes, or maybe in the community circle where they want them to be. And then what they'll tell me is, well, I haven't talked to my mom in 7 years, so I know she's not in those center circles. And then I ask them, I say, well, when your child does something that they're not supposed to do, how do you behave? What do you do? Well, I don't do what my mom did. Make sure I don't do what my mom did. And that's how I know. oh, your mom is a lot closer than you want her to be. You haven't talked with her in 7 years, but she still has so much influence in your life that the way you parent your children is based on not being like your mother. And when they recognize that, they're like, oh. So oftentimes their mother actually is in their focus. Not even as a family, but they're focused because they're so focused on not being their mother that you can see how the mother then has the influence still. The mother is influencing what they're doing and how they're behaving.
So I can see by that example the key to unlocking how people are going to primarily make mistakes in this labeling, which is that this is not a sphere of relationships.
Right.
And we want it sounds like it is because we talk about, oh, look, top, spouse, and now we have family, now we have friends, now we have these are all relationship terms.
Right.
And so you want to say, well, my relationship with this person is spouse, my relationship is family, my relationship is friend.
Right.
That's how I treat them, that's how much time I spend with them. But what we're talking about is something different. It's the influence that they have on your life, on your actions. And they can do that even when they're not there. They can do it from the grave.
Which is actually why Mr. Darcy, his parents, even though by the time we get to meet Mr. Darcy in the book, his parents are both dead, but they still have a positive influence in his life. And he references them several times.
Yeah. And Elizabeth and Darcy are both having a strong influence on each other throughout the second half of the book, even though the majority of that time they're not together. But they're both thinking about the other person and what the other person would do in these various circumstances, and how they feel about the other person is affecting a lot of the decisions that they make.
Right, and that's what we're talking about here about influence. We're talking about influence, right? How much influence does this person have in my life? Am I referencing them when I'm making decisions? And that's exactly like with this client that I'm talking about, or these clients, a good number of them actually, they reference their abusive or neglectful parent every time they make a decision. I don't want to be like them. I don't want to be like them. And so what we have to do in that case is help them to remove the parent's influence. And the only way to keep that parent's influence out of them, out of their life, is to replace that parent with somebody else that can fit and take on that role. So that instead of saying, I don't want to do this because that's what my mom would have done or my dad would have done, now they're saying, I want to do this because this person that I put in that spot, right? Remember, the parent's role is to uplift you, right? And so what you want to do is, if you need to remove a parent, then you need to find somebody else that can fit in that place and be the uplifting influence. Like, I want to be like, I want to do like this person, rather than I don't want to be like.
I was saying
my
that in our contemporary society that we have a problem with empty family shells, and that we need to fill those spots with found family. I think we also have a problem in our contemporary society that we sever relationships with people who should be in our family and friend spots too quickly. That people are not willing to put up with some discomfort and differences of opinion, that they put a negative label on something. You were talking about how people can be positive or negative influences. They say, you're a negative influence, and let's kick you out to the geopolitical sphere. Let's get you out of my life. And that can equally be, I mean, I don't know if equal.
Well, I have a really good example about that too.
Okay.
That's again a conglomeration of clients, because this is a really frequent problem. Oftentimes I'll have a client who comes in and they have one or two siblings, and they'll say, "Oh, I don't talk to my siblings." And as we talk, and I say, "Well, why not? What's the problem?" And 20 years ago something happened that was even minor, and yet they're just so angry with each other. And so in that case, we still have to do the remove and replace, right? Because something has probably taken the place of that sibling, and we have to remove that something and bring the sibling back in, or 20 years ago they removed their sibling and they've never replaced them, and that leaves that's a serious problem, because guess what comes in? Bitterness, resentment. Those are very damaging to ourselves, not just to our relationships, but to ourselves. And so you have to remove the bitterness and the resentment, and you have to re-invite that sibling back in. And so oftentimes what I'll do with them is I'll give them assignments such as, I might say, for the next week, I want you just to pray for your brother and just say, Heavenly Father, please help, David to have a really good day today. So, and I'll have him do that for a week. And then the next week I'll say, keep praying, but now each day after you pray, just send a text message to your brother and say, hey David, I hope you have a good day today. And so you gradually move them to where, and oftentimes it's really amazing how this happens. And it happens every time. I don't know that I've ever done this and it didn't work. But within a few weeks, usually they're coming back to me and they're saying, oh, my brother responded and he said this, and pretty soon they're actually having a good relationship, and they're all of a sudden they're calling each other and talking to each other, and it's like, it's amazing. Because oftentimes, like you say, we sever a relationship when we shouldn't. And it's amazing how easy it actually is to rebuild those relationships.
So there's some kind of golden mean here, because we both have to recognize when people are destructive influences on us and when we need to remove their influence from our lives, which doesn't always mean removing their presence from our lives.
Right.
But at the same time, we need to be slow to anger, patient, and understanding all the descriptions of charity that the Apostle Paul gives in the Corinthians when he's talking about suffering long and being kind and not easily offended. We don't want to be quick to remove and replace important people and relationships from our lives.
Well, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, we can remove not the person, but the conflict. That's much easier. It's actually easier.
And better.
And better, and it's much easier than people think. People think, oh, that's going to be impossible. No, removing conflict is actually very simple and very easy, and that's usually what we want to do. We want to remove conflict and replace it with something better. And even Elizabeth, with her parents, I think I love Pride and Prejudice because she does. I think Jane Austen does show that if somebody is so toxic they really cannot be in your life, there is a way to fix that problem still. But for most people, what we need to do is remove the conflict and replace it with love. Honestly, whether that's charitable love, and we've talked about the 4 different loves in
Are
other
the toxic
classes.
people you have to remove from your life Lydia and Wickham? Is that what you were thinking of?
Well, I think Wickham definitely is toxic enough that he needs to be removed, because his influence. Remember, we're talking about influence too, right? So somebody might make us mad, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily have a negative influence. We might be the negative one. We might be the one that's negative, and they may be a positive influence, but we're mad because we don't like the way they're being positive.
At the end of Pride and Prejudice, it says that Elizabeth helps support Lydia with gifts of money now and then, but Wickham isn't ever allowed to come to their home.
Right. And I think
that's, I guess, what I was thinking about the complete removal. The other people in her family that she's made less influential, she's created a little distance, a little space. She still has a regular interaction and relationships with.
I think
Kitty is the younger sister who maybe sort of did not have a positive influence, but she and Jane work on improving Kitty and helping her to
because they're good influences on Kitty, and Kitty is not as I think Kitty is more of the neutral influence. She's being influenced by Lydia a lot.
Yeah.
But once Lydia is gone, I think the book makes it pretty clear that Kitty is kind of calms down, and it's because Kitty's more of a neutral influence and not a negative or a positive. I think so. Here's the thing: when we say toxic, that need to be removed, mostly we're talking about somebody who's actually abusive, that's really abusive, and not by modern terms of abuse, because nowadays people will tell me, they'll come into my office and they'll be like, he called me a name, he's so abusive.
And you say, well, that was unkind.
Yeah, that's unkind, but that's not abusive. So you have to be really careful about what we're thinking of as abuse, but we also have to be really careful, because you don't want to push people away from you that you shouldn't push away. And we see this with couples all the time.
And you also
That's why divorce is so high. The divorce rate is so high because people claim that their spouse is toxic when they're not.
But you also don't want to downplay real abuse. People who are
right.
True abuse victims, often they're the ones justifying the abuse, and they need somebody to say to them, they need somebody to say,
here's the
hey,
thing.
This is not an okay way to be treated. You
right.
can't stay and be treated this way.
If you feel like you're being abused and you're watching this course, I recommend that you call us and make an appointment so that we can sit with you and help you figure out whether you're actually being abused or whether you're being mistreated in a little bit less severe way. If there's real abuse going on, then you need to get away from the relationship. If there's mistreatment going on, then there's ways to remove and replace that while staying in the relationship. And this is a really touchy topic because it's very hard to know, am I being abused or am I not?
And you often need an outside professional to help you figure
it
out.
Right, and oftentimes the problem is our society is telling everybody that everything is abuse. And at the same time, the people who are being abused are being told this isn't abuse. And so that's where we get this nowadays. It's very difficult to be able to tell whether remove and replace the person is the right thing to do, or remove and replace the situation is the right thing to do. Either way, you're going to remove and replace. But one case, you're going to remove and replace the person. The other case, you're going to remove and replace the. Let me give you an example of that. I know we're going to get out of time, but I just have to. So there's, for example, I had a client who came in to me years ago and just said, I hate my husband. I can't even stand to hear him speak. I just want to get a divorce. That client and I worked for about 6 months. And through that 6 months, I would give the client things to do. Things that would remove the bitterness and resentment that she had towards her husband, but not removing her husband. And she would get mad at me. Why are you always telling me to do these things? He's the one that needs to change. He's the one that's the problem. And I would tell her, sure, I do think he's mistreating you. I don't think what he's doing is right. I also don't think the way you're responding is right. So let's change your response and see what happens. And as she changed her response, eventually she came in. It was about a year after that. So about a year and a half of visiting with her. And she came in and she said, I really love my husband. And her husband eventually got really sick and was in the hospital, and she was just so worried that he was going to die. Whereas 2 years earlier, if he was in the hospital about to die, she'd have been like, woo, yay. And yet, and this later, the sessions became, instead of, I can't stand my husband, the sessions, 2 years in became, my husband is sick and he's dying and I don't know how to live without him. And so it was more of a, okay, let's help you learn how to deal with this new situation. But that's the thing is, oftentimes it's not removing the person. Oftentimes it's removing your own bitterness and your own resentment and replacing it with love for the person that you think is abusing you, but maybe isn't. But yes, is mistreating you. And that's one of the things you have to be able to recognize too, that sometimes we're being mistreated. And you can't justify that either.
Well, yes. But you can't justify it. And also, we all mistreat each other.
We do. Totally. And anyway, so to me that's the big thing. I think remove and replace is the way to fix any of the problems we've talked about in the spheres of influence.
Yeah.
If God
just last
uh-huh.
the last thing I want to talk about as far as problems in the spheres of influence before we wrap this up, but you were going to say if God.
No, go ahead.
Is how do we identify when something is in the wrong place? Specifically, how do we identify if the wrong things are in our focus? Because we might think, well, I've got God, I've got my spouse, I'm taking care of those things, and be unaware.
Well, that's what these women that I was telling you about, that they feel that way. They're like, oh no, I'm good. I'm nothing like my mom.
Yeah.
And to them that means, so when we put that together, they'll always put God, self, spouse.
So that's the point I'm making, is how do we identify when something is influencing us unduly?
Well, the primary way to do that is to look at yourself and ask yourself, why am I doing the things I'm doing? Why am I, in this case of these women, why am I parenting the way I'm parenting? Why am I reacting to my child the way I'm reacting? And if the answer is because I don't want to be like my mom, then your mom is in the focus. She is your focus. She's the one that's dictating the behaviors that you're doing. Same thing if it's your kids. Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Oh, because my kids want me to. Because my kids need this. Because my kids. If that's the case, if it's always your children are in the focus. And they should not be. And that's the one. Honestly, that is the biggest problem in our society today, especially within the Christian community, is that children work their way into our focus, and usually they end up pushing ourselves and our spouse out. Oftentimes we keep God as the center still, but ourselves and our spouse get moved way out. Our children become the focus, and one of the problems that we see with that's the biggest problem, is that when people become empty nesters, they don't know how to deal with each other, because they no longer, the focus is the children, and the children are no longer there. And so oftentimes that's the most common time. It used to be in the past, divorce was most common after 1 year and then or at 7 years. Those are the two most common. Now the most common divorces are actually empty nesters.
That's so weird.
Because they get
all the people that you used to think, oh, they've been married 25, 30 years, they've made it.
Yeah. And now, because they focused so much on their children, they get to this point and they don't know each other. They don't know how to deal with each other because there's no children to focus on anymore. And that's where the most common divorces are happening.
Now, if you're a parent of young children, you might think, taking care of my children takes up such a large percentage of my time. How can that not be my focus? I just want to remind you that this is influence, not time spent with each other. So you can be a parent of a young child, especially if you're the caregiving parent, and you can spend most of your waking hours caring for your children and still have an appropriate focus on God and your spouse.
Well, and think about it this way. If you're taking care of your children and your child misbehaves, who has the greatest influence on how you respond to that child? Are you asking yourself, what would God have me do in this moment? Are you asking yourself, what would my spouse like me to do? Are you asking yourself, what's my philosophy? How would I like to handle this situation? If those are the three people that you're asking that question to, you're probably in the right place. But if you're saying, what would my mom do? If you're saying, what would what does the church teach me to do? Those are not the right questions you should ask. What would God do? What would God have me do? And then, if that leads you to, what are the church's teachings? That's fine.
Or if your decision is, oh, my child, if I discipline my child, they're going to have a tantrum and they're going to overreact, and I'm going to have to deal with their emotional outburst, and I don't want to have to deal with their emotions, so I'm not going to discipline the way I would have otherwise.
Then the child is the focus, right? Because then you're saying, what would the child do? Right? So you can almost always tell who's in your focus by who am I thinking about when I'm making decisions, when I'm deciding what to do. Who is it that's influencing that decision? And if it's you, your spouse, and God,
in a balanced way.
Now, most of the time. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't think, oh, what would my mom do occasionally? Because your mom, and that's that family
influence.
Support. They should have an influence. The church teachings should have an influence.
But we're talking about what are the primary influences, the things that you're saying all the time.
Right.
And it shouldn't always be your spouse instead of you. And it shouldn't always be you not caring about what your spouse thinks.
Right. But it should always be God.
That's why I say that God is different than the spouse.
It should
is the
always
center, the center spot of all primary influence.
God should always be in your mind, in your decision making, and then next most common should be yourself and your spouse, about equal, and then your family beyond that, your friends beyond that, acquaintances beyond that. They should be less frequent, but they do have an influence, and they will have an influence, and that's
your
good.
Community.
Your community has an influence. It should have an influence, but that influence should be a minor influence comparatively to the greater influence of your focus and family.
All right. Could you give us a final homework assignment?
Well, your final assignment is this. What I want you to do is I want you to ask yourself the question that we just asked. Who am I thinking about when I'm making the decisions that I'm making? And be honest with yourself and find out who is actually in the focus in my spheres of influence. Is it God? Is it myself? Is it my spouse? Or have my children gotten into that focus? Has a parent gotten into that focus? Has my church calling gotten into that focus? That's another one that oftentimes can get into that focus. So that's what I want you to do this time, is just find out who's actually in your focus, and then if your focus is a little off kilter, and you need to remove and replace, then use the tool. Remove the person who doesn't belong there and replace them with the person who does. So if your children happen to be in that space, then the next time that your child does something to misbehave, rather than asking yourself what would your child do, or worry about your child's response, to your decision, ask yourself, what would God have me do in this case? What would I like to do? What would be my philosophy, and what would my spouse have me do?
All right. Thank you so much for participating in this class.